This summer, I went on retreat, as I regularly do. It was a week of meditation in Big Bear, California, in Southern California. And the retreat center is filled with beautiful coniferous trees, among others, including many Jeffrey pines, which I was not familiar with, at least I didn't realize I was. For those not familiar, Jeffreys are close kin with ponderosa pines, which some of you may know. And as I learned, they look very similar, and they share one particularly delightful characteristic, which is that their bark smells like butterscotch. Sounds like some folks haven't discovered that yet. I highly recommend next time you come around a ponderosa pine or a Jeffrey pine. Well, each morning of this retreat, I would wake up with first light and would walk up to the dining hall, make myself a cup of coffee, and I would drink it just standing there outside, watching the light grow in the sky, against the hills, and on those Jeffrey pines, their bark a luminous reddish brown. On the fifth morning of the retreat, right after that sunrise time, I was walking slowly down to the meditation hall, simply noticing each step and aware of the growing light all around. And as the path turned, there was this magnificent Jeffrey pine right off the walkway. I just felt called, so I approached it, and I placed my hands on its bark, and I pressed my face into it, and I inhaled. And the fragrance of butterscotch was overwhelming, so that stepping back onto the path, I felt giddy, and I laughed out loud, which is an odd, or at least out of the ordinary thing to do on a silent meditation retreat, which of course struck me as hilarious. So I laughed at my laughter, which made me laugh even louder. I have no idea what the person nearby on the path or anyone else in earshot thought of me breaking the silence by cackling, but I couldn't help it. I was drunk on Jeffrey pine. The thought of which, of course, made me laugh even harder. In the August Hakol, I shared a passage from Ross Gay's Book of Delights. A poet, Gay wrote this book of essays, essayettes, he calls them, short and journal entry-like, one a day for a year. In each, he writes on something or someone that for him has elicited delight. But the sources of delight aren't always what we would tend to think of as delightful. And even when they are, his writing uncovers things that many of us wouldn't notice or appreciate. This and his next book, Inciting Joy, which made me laugh and cry even more, felt to me like one long exercise in paying attention. Non-egoic, loving attention. Which is something I'm so grateful to retreat practice for and meditation in general, which is what happened that morning with the Jeffrey pine. I'd smelled that butterscotch many times in my life, even several times that week. It's lovely, but it's never done that to me. But that morning, after several days of practice, moving slowly, no distractions, simply returning again and again to my direct experience, my mind was more available, my heart more open. And so things become more vibrant, more there. Not just the sweet things, though. What's beautiful and also what's difficult in more compassionate and clear ways. Because no, I didn't walk around for the next few days drunk on tree bark. Retreat in general is hard, as much that has been buried rises to the surface. And this retreat was my first week-long since before COVID. So I was bringing so much that's occurred over these past few years, personally, professionally, within our community, in the world. That moment with the Jeffrey pine was right alongside many moments of tears as the shell around my heart softened. But not even really alongside, a piece of. It's the same set of muscles, we might say, that had me cackling from the pine bark as had me weeping with grief. And that relationship is at the heart of Ross Gay's writing, which is so much about the practice of living with a tender heart, of being moved by our lives, by one another, by this world. I want to say before I go on that I'm going to quote Ross Gay a bunch in this talk, and I love to, things that I'm reading and inspired by, share, and this one just really grabbed me. And so if you get to a point you're like, oh my gosh, Ross Gay again, I just want to say that there were many things that I had in there and then cut out. So you should know that I've restrained myself. So I just want to say that. So it begins with loving attention. By simply paying attention. Simply paying attention, though, as I always feel so poignantly when I go on retreat, is something our society increasingly places obstacles up against. Gloria Mark, a professor of information science at UC Irvine, has been researching for years how people use computers. And in 2004, the average length of time that people stayed on a single screen, so let's say one window, before hopping to something else, that average length of time was 2.5 minutes. I was astounded, she told Ezra Klein, who wrote about her findings. That was so much worse than I thought it would be, just 2.5 minutes at one thing. But that was just the beginning, Klein writes. By 2012, Mark and her colleagues found the average time on a single task was 75 seconds. Now it's down to about 47 seconds on one single thing before we hop to the next. As Klein puts it, this is an acid bath for human cognition. And I would say it's an acid bath not only for human cognition, but for human happiness and well-being. As Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel writes, humanity will not perish for want of information, but only for want of appreciation. The beginning of our happiness, he writes, lies in the understanding that life without wonder is not worth living. Life without wonder is not worth living. What we lack is not a will to believe, but a will to wonder. Those words were published in 1955. I sometimes think about poor Rabbi Heschel if he was like dropped into our world right now. That we won't perish for lack of information. Ross Gay describes his poetry workshops at the university where he teaches, contrary to more conventional critique-based models. He describes it like this: wondering together again and again and again, an endeavor of unfixing, of dismastery, of community-supported bewilderment is the practice. And psychologist Dr. Keltner asserts that a big part of well-being comes from what Jane Goodall calls being amazed at things outside yourself. So wonder, amazement, bewilderment, awe. That last word underscoring how vital those qualities, really these practices are within Jewish tradition as we begin these days of awe. In Hebrew, the Yamim Noraim. That word norah or yirah, the noun form, means awe or sometimes fear, and I always appreciate reverence. And while we might not think to put the words reverence alongside delight, I invite us as we go into these days to allow the seriousness of them to be partnered with delight, locating and nurturing things in our lives and in our world which lift our hearts. To know that it's okay if we're a little bewildered, maybe healthy if we're left wondering. And for Gay, delight is countercultural and political. He writes, for instance, about living as a black man in our society, embracing joy as resistance, pushing back against authorities that find his delight threatening. And he writes a lot about his garden, one entry celebrating the ways in which gardening invites repurposing and sharing. It might be, he writes, that the logics of delight interrupt the logics of capitalism. Genuine delight by its nature, I think he's saying, is not about owning or having anything. It comes from being open, witnessing, and appreciating, rather than claiming whatever is for ourselves. I think here of Martin Buber, that the one who says you or thou, that posture of true encounter, that person is in relation but has nothing, he says, has nothing. Or as Gay puts it, delight grows as we share it. And the logics of capitalism also tell us to get things done. Indeed, one of his entries is entitled Loitering. To loiter, or to linger, loaf, laze, amble, mosey, or one of any number of other words he offers, are all activities, or lack thereof, which for him are praiseworthy. Of course, this is not how they're regarded in our society. Those words, he writes, imply being unproductive, which leads to being, even if only temporarily, non-consumptive. And this is a crime in America, and more explicitly criminal depending upon any number of quickly apprehended visual cues, which he elucidates, though I trust we can all infer what they are, various indicators of race and class that determine whether this non-consumptive delight is threatening, is criminal in some way. But most striking for him is another synonym for loitering, taking one's time. Taking one's time, which, he writes, makes it kind of plain. For the crime of loitering, the idea of it is about ownership of one's time, which must be sometimes wrested from the assumed owners of it, who are not you, back to the rightful, who is. This passage made me think of another book that I read recently, Matthew Desmond's Poverty by America. In it, he tells the story of a young man named Julio, a permanent resident from Guatemala, who had to work 80 hours per week to support his mother and 2 siblings. He was working one minimum wage job every day from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., another minimum wage job from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., then going home, sleeping as much as he could, and starting all over. He was physically and emotionally depleted and had no life besides work or sleep. Desmond shares how Julio's 8-year-old brother, Alexander, told him one day that he was saving money. "I want to buy 1 hour of your time," Alexander told his older brother. "How much for 1 hour to play with me?" Julio looked at his brother and wept. Not long after that, he fainted from exhaustion in the aisle of a grocery store. Now, I don't want to suggest here, and I'm not saying that the relationship between wealth or even financial stability and delight is directly proportional, because it's certainly not. But I couldn't help but put these together, Ross Gay's Torah on loitering and the realities of many people working around the clock to provide basic needs for themselves and their families. Because I want to name a tension that feels present for me as I explore this practice of slowing down, taking more time to just be. I've considered, what does it mean for me with my social status, my economic privilege, with all the ways in which I have access and freedom that many others don't, to cultivating delight? My time doesn't feel owned by others. But while my delight never threatens the status quo, perhaps we all suffer from this orientation around production and consumption, the ways in which we affirm status or worth through busyness. Randy Woodley, a wise indigenous teacher here in Oregon, a friend to several Havurah members, recently shared with me a saying common among Native people, that the white man has a clock inside his head and takes himself so seriously. There's a striking connection here with one of the Hebrew words for delight, oneg. And if you're familiar with that word, it's probably because you know the phrase oneg Shabbat, which refers most commonly to the eating and schmoozing we do after prayer, but simply means the delight of Shabbat. How telling, I thought, that the most common usage of this word for delight is connected to a day that is all about slowing down. A day on which we shift, it is said, from the world of doing to the world of being. Because I don't know if we can experience delight when we're preoccupied with getting things done or anxious about how much we're not getting done, rather than giving our full attention to the one thing we're actually doing in any given moment. I wonder how much delight or simply connection or aliveness I miss out on because I, like many of us who live very privileged lives, still feel like I'm a slave to time. I wonder what it might look like to reorient our relationship to time. How can we live, even in the midst of the world of doing, with more of a practice of wonder and delight, somehow celebrating dismastery? What do we need to dismantle or perhaps soften within each of ourselves and collectively to nurture that kind of communal life? And if the logics of delight truly interrupt the logics of capitalism, then how do we nurture our delight in a way that moves us to work to extend that delight to everyone we can? To live with a tender heart makes room for sorrow as much as it does delight. It's through this gateway of sorrow, or rather the gateway of allowing whatever is to be, that we experience delight and joy, slowing down enough to feel, which maybe is another word for aliveness. The whole of it, interwoven and coexisting. I'll share one last piece from Ross Gay. This falling together, it is called. This holding each other through the falling. I'm pretty sure of this, one of the names anyway, joy. And given as we are always falling, we might always be holding each other like this. We might always be holding each other through our falling and submerged that way in the grave light of joy. Grave, that is serious, profound, weighty, risky even, awesome. That which makes us tremble, moves us. I was recently speaking with someone who suffered a tremendous loss. We were wondering together about why it's so hard for so many of us to simply be with someone in something like that. To be with someone without trying to fix or make them feel better or give advice or subtly minimize what they're going through. To simply witness, to be a patient friend, to accompany them a bit in what they're going through, to hold them through the falling. And in that spirit, I'll end with a poem that called to me, as it has called to me so many times. I've definitely shared it before, but it speaks deeply to what I'm trying to name here. Kindness, by Naomi Shihab Nye. Before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things. Feel the future dissolve in a moment like salt in a weakened broth. What you held in your hand, what you counted and carefully saved, all this must go so you know how desolate the landscape can be between the regions of kindness. How you ride and ride, thinking the bus will never stop. The passengers eating maize and chicken will stare out the window forever. Before you learn the tender gravity of kindness, you must travel where the Indian in a white poncho lies dead by the side of the road. You must see how this could be you, how he too was someone who journeyed through the night with plans and the simple breath that kept him alive. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak to it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to mail letters and purchase bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, "It is I you have been looking for," and then goes with you everywhere, like a shadow or a friend. the tender gravity of kindness feels so kin with the grave light of joy. Like the Hebrew kavod, honor, dignity, connected to kaved, heavy, the gentle weight, the weighty light of it all. So friends, let's find ways to keep our hearts open, or when they close, as they will again and again, to find ways to open them, however much we can, and to be with each other as we do. L'shana tova tikatevu, may we each be inscribed this year with and for great love and care. Shana tova.